Good afternoon. Thank you very much for your kind invitation. We've arrived from Quebec, but as you're going to realize very quickly, we have a French accent because we are French. And we will present a very interesting topic and a project that is still underway. So this is to compare with this morning's presentation. And the question is, how can we rehabilitate resilient communities? And in Argenteuil, which is a small city in the northwest of Montreal, well, it is a laboratory where we're working. So that's my team and myself. I'm a professor at the École d'Urbanisme et d'Architecture du Paysage, and I'm the director of the Équipe de Recherche à Réaction. And it's a great pleasure for me to present this with my student in doctorate. After law studies, I did a master's in urbanization in Montreal, and I started a doctorate just after joining Isabelle's research team at the Montreal University. And what's very interesting with all these young professionals, and I have one here in the room, Valentin, who's come to listen to us, they are all experts in certain areas, and the projects are even more interesting thanks to them. We have the pleasure of welcoming Eric last week. He came to visit this territory, which is going through a metamorphosis, and to think about the future of this space. So 3 major topics today, from vulnerability to resilience. We have to carry out risk diagnosis to understand how we can rehabilitate in a resilient way. A context in evolution. We like to understand the context so that then we can think about possible strategies, and at the end, this innovative approach co-built at Saint-André d'Argenteuil. The word construction is used like the word resilience in Quebec because it is essential to integrate all the stakeholders so that we can have a social and political acceptance of our work. And this innovative approach is financed. I am financing ministries, especially the Public Security Ministry, and here it is really financed for the prevention of disasters. And this project is the MRC and the REX project. And these 2 projects are complementary. REX is to work on experience feedback, floods, to understand what happened, the issues, and come up with something positive. And then the MRC project, here is a question of developing methods with indicators, a multi-criteria method. The Public Security Ministry saw that when they worked on damages, they worked on building damages with very strict calculations. And we realized that these damages, it's also the psychosocial, the environmental, the municipal taxation, and we're working with them to integrate these indicators in the formula. And of course, we're going to provide you with some definitions. The first definition on vulnerability, which is the will to have more sustainability on the territory. And this is a diagram that was developed by my colleague, Antonio da Cunha. And the objective is to reduce the vulnerability, to improve resilience, to have more sustainability, and to make sure that the projects we're going to build and co-build will not only allow us to reinforce this resilience, but they will allow us to work on this energy transition and make sure that we will have areas of nature and slow down the water flow. And this is the method developed together with La Sécurité Publique, the public security. So we have classified vulnerabilities and we have prescribed things according to the level of vulnerability. And now Anne-Laure is going to present the definition for resilience, because resilience is a term we hear a lot, which is very polysemic. And that the reason is that there are multitudes of disciplines, physical sciences, social sciences, environment, etc., that have contributed to the polysemia of this term. And we have the passage from theory to practice, And here again, we've studied this concept of resilience. And here we're going to apply to the territories in urban areas. And we have several definitions given here. The first comes from the Ministry of Public Security in Quebec. This is the aptitude of a system which was exposed to hazards to adapt itself by resisting or by changing so as to establish an acceptable level for all its structures. We have another definition from researchers. The last two definitions stem from different authors. So the second one is from Isabelle, and here we say that we need concerted strategies. We need to anticipate, we need to adapt to strengthen this capacity for resilience of the systems. And the third definition is also from the various authors. And here it's a question of survival, adaptation, and growth, whatever the chronic stresses undergone by a system. So we really tried to be objective in our definition of resilience. We wanted to make it more operational. This concept was highly theoretical for a long time. And so in order to do so, we had to develop a certain number of indicators. And these indicators were developed and they emerged thanks to a multidisciplinary cooperation and thanks to the consultation with several players. So here in this quote, you can see that we are putting forth our collaboration, our cooperation, and we want to include several players, economic, political, professionals, or the local population. And so here you can see the various criteria that were retained by our team, our reaction. So we have diversity, equity, autonomy, transparency, compatibility of the data, robustness, inclusion, redundancy, education, rigor, integration, innovation, flexibility, and reflection. So all these criteria come from various sources, especially the 100 Resilient Cities NGO, which is from the Rockefeller Foundation. We took inspiration from various authors, researchers like André Dauphiné, Modaben Covitolo, or Isabelle. And currently in Quebec, we are rebuilding, transforming this area because of the various floods that affected Quebec in 2011, 2017, and 2019. There was a real awareness from the government in Quebec, and they tried to meet all these different issues. So after the floods in 2017, it's the Ministère de la Sécurité Publique that came up with an action plan in terms of civil security because of all these floods, and they wanted to strengthen various areas in risk management, that is, prevention, preparation, knowledge, and rehabilitation management. And after the floods in 2019, it is the Ministère des Affaires municipales et de l'Habitation, the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Habitation, that came up with a protection plan of the territory because of the floods. And this plan is divided into four. The first is to map, the second is to govern and secure, the third one is plan and intervene, and the fourth is communicate. Then afterwards, last year at the same time, we had a new law, the Law 67, that was it's Act 67, that was made by the government, aiming at managing floods, the areas that could be flooded, the lakes in Quebec. Today we have a regulatory framework which is temporary. We're waiting for the next law, which is being prepared by the Ministère de l'Environnement, the Environment Ministry in Quebec, and the Ministère des Affaires municipales et de l'Habitation. So we are working with our teams for this future framework. Yes, absolutely. And what's interesting is that we're not only working on projects, but we're working with the ministries to be part of this change. So we're working in this project, and we're not only allowing the territories to work. I mean, the territories realize what is possible, what is not possible. And there is a mapping of the hazards with a homogeneous method, and we have the analysis method of vulnerabilities and resiliences. I'm going to go faster because we don't have much time. Saint-André d'Argenteuil, you see the floods. Their major difficulty is that they were flooded in 2017 and in 2019. So 3 little villages, therefore, that merged, and then afterwards we have put it in the MRC of Argenteuil with the floodable areas, and what is in blue are the areas that can be flooded. Now, with the mapping, we change the terms. So I have been flooded already. I won't have any more floods before some 300 years from now. But no, not at all. And we see it between 2017 and 2019. Unfortunately, there can be more floods. And here we've mapped the sectors I want to talk to you about. Very important, the sector of the Baie de Carillon, Terrasse Robillard, Rue Fournier, Saint-André-Est. And what's interesting with this project is that it has a political bearing. The mayor whom we met with Eric came to get us. And several colleagues were talking about all this in the media. And he said, I have a small municipality, I have a major issue at stake. My citizens are at risk. Please help me design a project, and a project where we'll not only move things, but we will have options, strategies, so that they can remain in our city. We don't want them to leave. You see, it's difficult to tell citizens you must move, go away, but yeah, but where? Especially with the prices and with the COVID, the price of real estate has really gone up. And so that's the beauty of this project, which really attracted us. And as geographer, I like maps, very important to understand the territory. And so gradually, from the 50s until 2021, that's where we stand today. And this is what's interesting. And we can link up with yesterday's conferences and today's, the importance of time, of space, and the importance of what is lived in and what is not lived in. And you see, gradually, citizens, we like water. They got closer to the waters. And in red, it's a bit difficult to see in 2021, we see the current issues, which are, some homes were flooded at more than 50%, and the state wanted to destroy them. So we have a territory which is full of holes. There are holes, and nature is invited in these areas, and it is not always wanted, this nature. And so that is also very interesting. Now, to understand the territory, we need to have data, rigorous data. And thanks to this rigor, we'll have transparency and the acceptance from the citizens and the elected councillors. So this is the new method. We can't tell you much about this. We are working on this. They have used the English methods, area that can be flooded every 100 years, and we use the depths. We also use the speeds. I know that you do it in France because the speed at which anything is flooded, the speed of the current is fundamental to provide enlightened solutions. So here you have the 3 sectors, and you can see that Terrasse Robillard or Baie Carillon, you can have more than 90 centimeters of water, which is quite high. And we've also developed a method to analyze vulnerability, and this is very important, and this is what we're trying to do. We're training the officials, and this vulnerability is very interesting because the objective is to map not only a social vulnerability, that is who is on these territories, a territorial vulnerability, the famous infrastructure, which are essential, all the heritage, we want to protect the heritage of these assets, and all that is related to access, because a territory that is not accessible is a territory which is at risk. And here we collect all the data, but it's important to see what's behind all this data, and then we separate all the data. And here you see the sector of the Terrasse Robillard, more than 20 meters of water. That means that the firemen have trouble getting there, and thanks to the firemen, they don't go through the road. They go with boats to help the citizens who've stayed back, the famous Gauls who stayed back. So we end with the risk analysis, as you can see here, which is the hazard and the vulnerability together. And on the other side, you have the map showing the potential risk and the reality. That is the floods in 2017, 2019, and sometimes with more than a meter of water. And when we talk about the changes on the territory, well, what do we see? We see that there are a lot of holes and gaps. And it's very difficult when we think about revamping territory. It's like a puzzle. But here you have the pieces of the puzzles that are changing, and we are redrawing the space. And the major contradiction, and this is why we're working on policies and regulations on a given territory between 2017 and 2019, some homes were reinforced, some were immunized. I mean, it's not the right word, but they were adapted, and some homes were destroyed because they were really destroyed. And there are some territories that need to be restored naturally. So we need to follow these tools, monitor these tools, and we need to be coherent. And we are urbanists, and what is important when we work on a building is where does this building stand? And we work a lot on these districts to make sure that these districts are viable. At Saint-André d'Argenteuil, we're getting there. It's a co-build approach, and that's very important. In North America, we have to integrate the various stakeholders to have a political and social acceptance. So here you have different players, stakeholders with whom we work, the municipality, professionals, ministries, very important, the regional organizations, the MRC, and the citizens. The citizens, well, we found the tools, the committee. This is the river committee, and here there are two rivers, and we can discuss about all these issues with the citizens, and then it trickled down to the different districts. And some citizens were in favor of the project and others were against, and therefore we had a good idea. So these drawings were done thanks to surveys with the citizens for the imaginary. What would you like to have? And here they want to go back to nature. Going back to nature means you can go fishing, you can have access to that nature. And that nature is destabilized by pollution, the species that are invading that area since the pollution. And the mayor would like to have banks, access to these banks, and he would like people to come and sit. I have 5 minutes left. That's going to be very difficult, so we're going to continue. And then the sustainability, have more density in the city.
I'll be quick. Our objective was to develop educational activities in an academic way. There were 2 lessons, one in risks and urban risks in redevelopment, and the other one in landscape planning. And the students, including myself, were a part and parcel of this brainstorming exercise. We came up with a number of scenarios, and here they are. For instance, well, these are some examples. Relocation. I'll talk about this later on. Relocation of the Terrasse-Robillard and the Becker-Billon-Rue Fournier sectors to a place that cannot be flooded. And another one based on the stratification or layering of functions. It's based on a spatial and functional approach on housing units so that they would do with water. There's plants in the architectural design, but also the volume design, so that we can quickly absorb the water and naturally. So there's a layering. There are 3 levels. The first level is an open void, 1.5 meters. That's the only function for this level. Second level is with movable goods, far away from the essential goods that you need in a house. And the third level or layer is with the bedrooms, the living room, sitting room, bathroom, etc., which is the sheltered and protected level, thanks to the other levels that can be flooded, but not the third one. Another thing is restoration or redevelopment of riverbanks, and we want them to be more stable. We did this with plants, with deep roots to keep the soil, and to preserve or to have quality water, and to avoid contamination of the soil with pollutants. There are different layers of plants. We have herbaceous and shrubs. And finally, the valuation of public spaces, pedestrian precincts, for people to have a stroll in the forest to observe fauna and flora. So cities are at the heart of climate change. Their future will depend on our ability to invent inhabitable urban spaces that are fair and resilient. We'll continue very quickly. We'll take a bit more time, though, because it would be a pity if we couldn't show you the full scenario. This is the mayor's project. There are three major themes: renaturalization and relocation. Number two, innovative development in floodable regions, and adaptation, which is number three. The objective is to co-design these three scenarios little by little, but in a synchronous way at the same time, so that we have homogeneous urban and town planning. Space reorganization, that is relocating and displacing population. We have 172 homes that can be flooded in the Saint-André d'Argenton with 3,000 inhabitants, and therefore in this case we thought that we would listen to the needs of the inhabitants and the dwellers to know what they need in these sectors, in areas that cannot be flooded. Therefore, the places that are not risky, they want something that's green. They want to have links between the different dwellers. They want to be close to the water, but also they want to have access to the river banks, because many homes and houses at present have private access to water and the river beds. The river banks, sorry. We'd like this to be collective. Look at this drawing. It was done with the mayor. And what's difficult for the time being in reorganizing things spatially, according to the mayor's wishes, and as Eric was saying last week, is that if you look at some districts here, well, maybe the colors should be changed, because in some districts we would like to relocate the population, even though it's risky, averagely risky, whereas in other cases we think that people can be displaced, but they will have to go to non-risky areas. But after a crisis, what do people do? They seize opportunities. And what are they? Well, to renaturalize as much as you can these areas which are natural zones, and also give public access to the riverbank. Well, of course, that's easy to understand, and to adapt the existing districts and to create these places where people will cohabitate, and that'll be friendly places. So for the town to be rebuilt and to keep the inhabitants. That's the mayor's scenario. But we work on another scenario, because the objective for us is that we wanted a scenario that's acceptable in terms of the coming regulation, and we want something that we can fund, because you see, we have a plan that's really good. We have a plan to protect the territory, but there's a call for project as well in parallel. So our objective is to develop a project that we can fund, that the government can fund. And also, we don't want citizens to be in a dangerous or hazardous place. What's very difficult, and I'll show you the conclusion, by the way, is that we saw massive changes in terms of how people perceive risks. And it's been the case in the past 2 years. After the floods in 1997, people wanted to leave. The inhabitants wanted to leave. And after 2 years of floods, they wanted to leave. But 2 years down the road, we had spats of drought. And with COVID, the price of homes really skyrocketed. People need to go to the countryside. And now it's very difficult if you want people to be displaced. So we'll have to educate the local population and work on that. Now, these are the ingredients. This is what it takes before you could redevelop resilient communities. And as we said earlier on the first slide, as you saw, we need to have a regulation that's adapted to the needs of the local citizens. We also want to have a continuous urban fabric. At present, it is what we call a mitage, that is moth-eaten type of town, and due to urban sprawl. So we want to displace the people in areas where the risks are not as high. Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Alnor. Thank you very much, Isabelle, as well. We're going to invite Agence Meet. Now, this afternoon, the title is to imagine and to share open shelters. Well, it's easier to imagine them than to share them, because after listening to Isabelle and Anne-Laure, the renaturalization of the Saint-Laurent, which is bigger than the Seine River, with some icebergs in spring, well, you get on the mayor's car and then they will say, oh, I'll get rid of these 200 homes. But as you realize on your way, you'll realize that these homes are being rebuilt by those who are wealthy enough, or they're being destroyed if you're vulnerable. And we know that before we can displace people and relocate people, it'll take a lot of time. But yet, thank you very much. Now, Agence Meet, Agency Meet. Hello, thank you very much for inviting us to your symposium and colloquium. I hope you can see what's on the slide. We are a young agency with 8 architects and urbanists, or town planners, urban planners, and the objective for us is to work on rural areas and sensitive areas. And we focused on natural disasters and coastal disasters, not just those in Normandy, in the Massif Central mountainous region. And this time we've decided to choose a place in Martinique. We started at a territorial level and urban level when we were postgraduates or at the university, and now it's much more operations-oriented. So we look at conceptual assumptions, but also at the reality of what's happening over there in Martinique. So for this presentation, well, on the basis of our practice and on the basis of our project, we've decided to look at it from the philosophical point of view. We've taken this stance and we've looked at things asking ourselves a broader type of scoped question. The question being, couldn't we say that climate change is an opportunity for us to reinforce a local culture? We'll see how. Number one, we'll start from landscape planning and the structure of the environment, so the territorial scale, the urban scale. And then we'll look at housing units and the districts. And then the third part, which is more of a philosophical question. We've used the works of Malcolm Ferdinand, an engineer in the environment in Martinique, and has a doctorate in political environment. And the driving force for us, or the point of focus, was the waters rising. This is where we are. This is where Martinique is, close to the Caribbean, close to, on the Atlantic. So we have an arc of islands, which is a Zone 5 earthquake region. And Le Prêcheur is a small village to the north of Martinique. And, well, you can't drive around the island there, as you can see. So you see where the roads are. So that's the beginning of a tropical forest here. We have 1,500 people in the village, mainly in informal dwellings. So the question of natural disasters have to be looked at in a different way, through different lenses. Oikos nomos and oikos logos for ecology. So that means both rules and language. And at the crossroads is oikos, that is the habitat where you live in a spatial way and a natural way, which is what architects do, and town planners and urban planners as well. So as you can see, these are all the known natural disasters except for avalanches. Yet it can happen with mud here on the hydrographic corridors. These are all the risks on the same map. But in fact, the whole map should be read because there are risks of earthquakes reaching level 5. I hope you can see this as well. The first thing that we did is that we wanted people to understand that the coast is not like a border between sea and land. It's some type of thickness. You have natural disasters going from the land to the sea, floods and hydrographic disasters, and natural disasters coming from the sea, like flooding. So we are at the interface between these two types of movements on a mobile geography that's very sensitive. And most of the people who live on the coast, as you can see. And that's where all the amenities are as well. These are some photos. That's far away from what you might think Martinique looks like, because in this place there are no tourists. This is the village. As you can see, there's no more sand or beach. They've lost a lot of beach, so they might suffer directly from hurricanes and huge waves. And as you can see, we have a lot of gardening here, and market gardening and local farming. We looked into history. And on the map, before the 19th century, what you can see is that the coast was not very much inhabited. Most of the citizens were living in the Morne, that is, on the little mountains and hills there that you can see on the map. And the coast was only used for trading, fishing. It was an interface of mobility and exchanges. It was not a place where people would settle. In 1902, the first eruption of the Montagne Pelée mountain happened. 28,000 people died. Just one person survived. There were supposed to be legislative elections, and the authorities didn't want anybody to leave the town due to the elections. So Saint-Pierre, the capital city at the time in the Caribbean, was destroyed, as well as Le Pêcheur, the other town nearby. And that's when the authorities decided that it would be banned. They would ban people from settling down here. In 1922, there was a second eruption that could be stopped. Part of the inhabitants were protected and sheltered, and at that moment, that's when really the two cities disappeared. Yet people decided to live here again because they said it was a place where they could live and find something to eat. And this is where we have really fertile soil on the island. So they decided to settle again on the coast, even though there was a ban. That's why you have all these informal dwellings and places there alongside the coast. Here's another picture on the other side, on the Atlantic side. This is called Nord-Plage in the region of Macuba. This time, the citizens had to leave when the water was rising, due to the water rising. So there's a sense of urgency again. They had to escape, and they were displaced and found other housing units. But as you can see, we still have the remains of a destroyed village. So we had to rethink this spatial redevelopment so as to avoid these situations. Yet we wanted to show that this might happen. Well, of course, it has to be accepted by the local inhabitants. We surveyed the existing built structures, and this is what a restaurant on the seaside would look like in the French West Indies. They're quite strong against the high waves, and you have the kitchen there, as you can see, and that's where people can have their own dinners and eat. As you can see, this is very light as a structure. It can be blown away by the hurricane, but you can rebuild them quite quickly. Hurricane would last a maximum of 72 hours, so that's acceptable for the local dwellers. And we thought, couldn't we reuse this idea at a territorial level from the architectural level? So we looked at the pre-Columbian dwellings. At the time, this is what they were looking like. It was groups of families with a collective dwelling in the middle that was used for food, storing food, and also used by the local community. And you had these huts or places where people would stay at night for families. In between, people were in the so-called Caribbean garden. And these were the subsistence types of agriculture. And this is the Creole survey with more modern huts. And you can see what we saw before with different types of homes, something that's hard, and also the other parts of the structure that can be blown away by the wind. And this is the type of model that we can see in terms of informal dwellings and homes. We have a Caribbean garden that's been modernized in the different streets. And what you see here has nothing to do with town planning. This is public spaces, semi-private spaces, and it's very difficult to delineate covered spaces, non-covered places, and therefore sometimes you have to cross, if there's a plot of land, you have sometimes to cross your neighbor's plot of land before you reach your own home. So nothing's been well planned in advance in terms of town planning. Our project had three dimensions that are quite simple: to live on the top sides, the hillsides, and the valleys, and also on the plateaus, rather than having a general drawing that would apply in the region. We have therefore three tools. I'm not going to give you all the details, but you see there's a link between economy and the forms of the territory. The first one is a local currency. Financing is influenced very much by the urban form, as we said earlier on. That is, we have amenities, that's where we want to focus and have our funds, and something more flexible that can be blown away by the wind. And in addition, we had another agreement to go away from the French PLU, that is the traditional town planning and urban planning. We wanted to consider this as a mobile area. And you see these are traces, what we call the traces. Contrarily to a plot, to a system of plots of lands, people manage their plants on the basis of the water that falls. Either sometimes it's perpendicular, sometimes it's parallel, so that we can keep the ground thanks to the roots, so that we could have something else than glyphosates in the soil due to agriculture. So what we decided to do is use plants, and then we had an ecosystemic lease connected to the informal dwellings, and the objective is to show that the rents might be connected to the seasons and the way people live. And this is what it would look like for the plateaus, the valleys, and the mountains. This is the current village here, and then here on the top hills, we have collective amenities or schools, and then a place of refuge should there be something going wrong in terms of climate changes. And then around those, you have homes there, and then close to the seaside, you have also lighter structures, so that if the road disappears, you can still move here and have some types of exchanges on the coastal side. Then, after reshuffling things in space, what are the two main risks? It's earthquakes and cyclones, or hurricanes. And the question is the emergence of a social and environmental environment. We wanted to produce housing units in a different way. This is in the French Antilles. It's a tropical climate, yet the housing units look like any other housing unit in mainland France, as you can see here. We took a photo this way on purpose. As you can see, the front of the building is very compact, very little openings. There's a lot of thermal inertia in the construction materials, which is good for us in mainland France, but not over there. Public areas, as you can see, that look like not much. It's sealing of soils, not much shade, very good for cars, but awful for pedestrians, whereas if you know what the French Indies do, people live outside, whereas here it's like we oblige people to live inside. Well, sorry, you can't see anything on that slide, but here's an example of dwellings on a slope. Well, use your imagination. Here we have the different grades, the different levels, with hedges to preserve ecological and hydrographic corridors, and to have movements that adapt to the slope. That is everything that was not covered by the traditional town planning systems, to have different types of gardens and nature and countryside. All this following a rationale of a non-plot rationale. We didn't want any visible plot. We wanted to have something that's shared, rather, or that could be in common. This is what you can see here, the interior and the exterior. And the most important, probably, is what's outside these homes. You see the structures that are covered and those that are not. We did that because our approach was to think about cyclones and also earthquakes. It's easier with earthquakes to find a solution. There were 3 different levels here. Here's the nucleus with masonry work, mainly with clay, and the water we took after there were landslides. And this level with the water adduction and electricity, etc., to eat, sleep, and have electricity. And these are the modules on top, thanks to which we can add modules and rooms over time, should your family grow, or if you start with a little budget, and then fibrous elements to be protected and sheltered from the sun. But this is, as I said, informal dwellings. So what's important is that we want families to be able to build their homes themselves. It's not something that's one size fits all. And then we would reduce construction costs in a very tiny place, and then you can add more as you go to your home. And then you have covered areas, which doesn't look like what you have on mainland France. If you have 43 meters that are covered, you have more than 100 meters that are covered here, whereas in mainland France, it's the opposite. So it doesn't follow mainland regulation, but we're doing this because we'd like to finalize our project. And then on the left, what you can see is what it's going to look like during a year. And on the right-hand side, the cyclone design, that would last 24 to 72 hours. So you see some rooms can still be used under tropical climates. And then when there's a hurricane or cyclone, you have this shelter in these 2 rooms, and the rest would disappear due to the wind. This is the nucleus, and these are all the variations to show you all the different layouts and how this can be changed by those who live there, because it's a modular system. And then a cross-section that shows you what it looks like. It's bioclimatic, according to us. So there's the natural risks, there's the climate, and architecture in this case translates in space and in an informal way, translates 2 dynamics, one connected to the social and the other one to the environmental context. And these natural hazards or disasters are the reasons why the architects do this. Philippe Ram, for instance, in l'Histoire naturelle de l'architecture, says that nature is connected to human beings, and these climate events happen, and an architecture is an extension of some type of clothing. This is also a selective mode. We choose the desirable weather conditions. That is, we want to have some sheltered areas with natural airflow, and also we want to be protected against strong winds and strong sun rays. And since human bodies might be burned, since the other risks is strong rains or strong winds, since the earth might quake, then the natural risks are the reasons why we've designed such an architecture. And I have 5 minutes, okay, I'll be quick. And therefore, this bioclimatic home is a translation of what we wanted to do. I will be even faster. I wanted to talk about the philosophical questions. The question is the links that exist between the environment, the human beings, and the non-humans in the Caribbean.
Malcolm Ferdinand, qui lui parle d'une double fracture sociale et environnementale. Je ne vais pas rentrer dans le détail du coup parce qu'il n'y a plus le temps, mais derrière en fait le travail qu'on a été amené à mener, la question de la créolité ressort en permanence. Et du coup lui, à l'inverse de l'anthropocène, il parle de plantationocène, qui serait une ère qu'on traverse aujourd'hui due avec le changement climatique, due en fait à la transformation du monde en plantation à travers finalement les différents empires coloniaux qui ont modelé le reste du monde à leur image. Donc sur cette carte, c'est plutôt l'Empire britannique, mais on voit autour la question de l'emport de chaque civilisation qui va avec, et qui ont conduit à des effondrements locaux de chaque société et biodiversité, et qui a transformé du coup la Terre et le monde en plantation. Donc en fait, ce qu'il appelle plantationnisme fait émaner une forme d'habité colonial qui emporte avec lui un mode de transformation du paysage et du coup un résultat formel du territoire auquel on a affaire. Et ici, du coup, on voit différentes plantations, y compris aux États-Unis, donc ce n'est pas qu'une question tropicale et caribéenne. Et de là, en fait, aujourd'hui, on est toujours dans ce paysage-là. C'est-à-dire que même si on a changé certaines règles politiques ou modernisé un certain nombre de façons de faire techniques et mécaniques, le résultat du paysage dans lequel on habite, c'est toujours le même. Et je passe rapidement, mais du coup, dans le projet que je viens de présenter, à chaque fois qu'on essaye de le passer à l'opérationnel, on a un certain nombre de freins législatifs, réglementaires et normatifs, que ce soit à l'échelle territoriale et urbaine, mais aussi à l'échelle architecturale et même constructive. Et finalement, à chaque fois, ces règles-là, elles émanent d'un mode de pensée et d'un mode de faire qui renvoie à ce que Ferdinand décrit comme l'habité colonial, donc cette forme qui va avec l'agriculture intensive, l'extraction des ressources et le mode de transformation du territoire avec l'habitation et tout ce qui s'y déploie. Et là, par exemple, sur la question de deux filières, autrefois on construisait à la briqueterie avec tout un tas de produits différents. Aujourd'hui, ils ne produisent plus que de la brique parasismique, qui est finalement l'équivalent d'un parpaing en brique de terre cuite. Et ça, c'est uniquement pour une question de normalisation. C'est-à-dire que parce qu'on est en Europe, en Martinique, parce que les eurocodes sont passés, aujourd'hui, les tuiles qu'on achète en Martinique, les carrelages, les enduits, sont importés d'Italie. Alors que, et pour une raison de coefficient d'étanchéité de la tuile. Alors qu'on a quand même des édifices qui...
And we have buildings that are here and that have been here for 200 years. And they are very strong and resilient. The same question appears with bamboos, and we've seen the same in other countries. In France, the regulation is such that you cannot carry a bamboo, even though it is cut, though it is accepted in permaculture. And my conclusion, as an alternative to the plantation scene, he talks about the marronnage, which is the Feolite lakes. That is when the slaves escaped and they would be in the forest to set up their own resilient communities, and therefore they recreated a link with nature. And that's when he says that the slaves gained their freedom again and became the children of America, thanks to the Creole metamorphosis. And you can't see this in our project, but at least the question is that of resilience to water rise and climate changes, since we have to think about the matrix links that exist between human beings and non-humans in the Caribbean environments. Then the question is that of a second Creole metamorphosis. And rather than seeing this as something appalling or disaster, it would be an opportunity to reassert the role of the local community. And here's another quote of the mayor after our study, and even today when we asked him, why should you go on living there, given the number of risks and hazards that there are, he says, well, if we were to leave, it would mean that we have failed. We've not managed to change how we live and how we function, and that we can't work in the environment, even though these events are very strong. It would mean that we accept that we failed, we the designers and also all the politicians. I'll finish on that note because I think I was too long. Thank you, Félicien. Now, this afternoon, as you've seen, the topic is open shelters. I presented one for one district. Isabelle talked about a city, and Félicien has looked at another scale a house, a dwelling, and even air tightness, water tightness, the brick and the bamboos transported to build these shelters. As if we discussed this ahead of time, we could do the same as well. Theoretically, we could say we're looking for a shelter, or what we want is to escape. And by the way, Marcelin, that's the name of the mayor, who's attended all of the colloquiums from the Ministry of Ecology, is someone who has guts and courage. And we need these tough eggs sometimes. The Saint-André d'Argenteuil mayor is also convinced about what's changing at present. And it's very important to focus on these individuals. Their presence is very important before we talk about the citizens. Now we're going to continue. Now that we've talked about districts, towns and homes and materials, we're going to move to landscape. We'll welcome Andrea Oldani, who's going to be talking about Milan.
Good afternoon. I need to understand how does it work. Okay. My presentation is about one work in the metropolitan city of Milano. Actually, this work is reflecting my research since when I did the PhD. My research is about the landscape of contemporary infrastructure and, in particular, how to combine architectural design, landscape design inside of the problem of the transformation of rivers and water infrastructures. Now I'm working logically also with the students on this topic, so I built it with the municipality of Melzo, one research focusing on the Molgora stream or Molgora Creek, that is a small river running from the north of the Pre-Alps towards the metropolitan city of Milano. The starting point of my reflection is, first of all, the relationship between rivers and natural artificial dynamics. So we can see also from these drawings that rivers are highly unstable, and so they are subject to continuous modifications. And this instability is also representing the force that during the time people fighted, continuing transforming the rivers. So we can see some, for example, some etchings from a book from the 17th century about how to manage the waters of the Tiber River in Rome. And we can see also how the technology of the time was very poor, so they were working with some natural materials, trying to combine artificial banks and so on. But the technical evolution of the construction led to this kind of massive transformation. So everywhere in the world we can find these highly artificial rivers where basically there is no more space for nature, but in the same time there is no more space for people and for landscape, but also an increasing level of risk. And the Molgora is reflecting this kind of condition. So here we can see, for example, a classic relationship between river in equilibrium, ecological equilibrium, and the condition of highly artificial features that we can find inside of the urban development. So the Molgora is placed exactly in this last category, so the category more far from the natural conditions. But also, this is not the Molgora, but is another stream called Morla, so we have similar names for different streams. But this is exactly the condition that is representing also another kind of risk. So the risk of frequent flooding, so the hydraulic risk, but also the risk of losing any ecological structure, any ecological connection along the river, the losing of contact between river and people, but also the risk of living in one environment where the river is representing like a problem. So people are, how to say, scared by the presence of the river. They don't recognize anymore the value of the river as a significant part of the original landscape of these areas. And I think this photo that I took of the Morla is well representing how is, how to say, not friendly, not something that you can like, you can love. And this is a condition that we can find very frequently along the axis of the Molgora. Here we can see the watershed of the river Molgora from the Alps, where it is running in a very natural and qualitatively high condition, and then in a very dense urban region corresponding in part to the metropolitan city of Milano, where the stream is constricted inside of artificial banks and is running also inside of the urban diffusion of many cities. And of course, this is also representing a very high problematic condition in terms of risk. Here we can see a map of the risk, but also a map representing all the infrastructural artificialization of the river. So we have artificial banks, but we have a lot of crossings, and all the dots are basically representing bridges that are representing very complicated hydraulic nodes. So the bridges are obstaculating the flow of the water, creating problems in time of flooding. And the risk map is also not really 100% right in underlining the risk conditions, because, for example, in the city centers, the banks, the concrete banks are very high, so the impression from the map is that is safe, but these artificial concrete banks are very old and potentially subject to some problems during the flooding and collapse. The risk of collapsing is a true risk, is a real risk. Here we can see some of the landscape along the river, so we can see the relationship with some agricultural lands where the river sometimes is taking the original morphological features, but also the places where it's getting inside of the cities and is very involved in the urban dynamics. But also in the agricultural land, as you can see from this photo, any ecological link, any ecological connection is missing, because the river was also very polluted, and so the trees died, and the trees didn't grow anymore in this place. Now the ecological condition of the water are better. Fishes are back in the Molgora, but the trees didn't come back because of various kind of situations. By the way, let's go to the case studies that I addressed to my students, the municipality of Melzo. And here we can see how the Molgora is crossing the city of Melzo. This is the same situation in 1954. And as you can see, the river Molgora was still completely outside of the urban center of Melzo, and it was part of a very clear ecological network. You can recognize trees along the stream, you can recognize lines of trees inside of the agricultural lands that were representing this complexity, this ecological complexity. Actually, the river was already artificialized with some artificial banks, but this was a condition still acceptable. But slowly the city grew up towards the river, first of all with some industrial settlements, and then with some expansions of residential, mainly residential houses, small family houses. And in 1962, you can see that the first extra Molgora neighborhood was started to grow, and also the fragmentation of the streams increased with new bridges, new crossings. This situation increased also in the 70s, with still some voids, some potential ecological places. And then in 2019, we can see that basically the river is completely inside of the urban, involved in the urban dynamics. And the Molgora is also a place of fragility for several reasons. So I already mentioned the hydraulic risk, the flooding that is more or less every 2-3 years doing something. And then fragility in terms also of visibility of the river inside of the city. But this situation, in my opinion, it was increased by the pollution. Here we can see 2 stages of the pollution that I think are quite relevant. The first one is during the fascist period, in 1929, they were celebrating the opening of the sewage of Melzo. And this is the emissary of the sewage inside of the river Molgora. This at the time was representing the modernization, and also the mayor and all the main protagonists of the public life were really taking the photograph on the flow of the sewage. This is quite funny today, but it's also representing our perception change during the time. And then in the 70s, this floating island of plastic, any kind of material released into the river as an open-air sewage. This was related to the industrialization, the public sewages, and problems that nowadays are solved. And some photos are showing the actual condition of the river. You can see that basically you cannot feel any natural presence in the city, but also when it's little more natural, is highly artificial. And the river is crossing important places with some qualities, like for example here, where it's crossing the sporting area with a lot of potential points in terms of new development and redevelopment, but also a very high risk. For example, here we can see that some underground floors of the buildings are basically above the level of the water because they excavated, and this is representing also our approach to the rivers that was very bad during the time. And those are more or less the conditions that the student received in order to develop some visions for the river Molgora and following also some indications of the public administrations. So since one of my topic of research is about the cross-sections and urban and territorial transects, the idea was working on 5 different transects where to develop some investigation. 2 of them are the transition points between the countryside and the city, and 2 are inside of the city where there are some green spaces that are now completely divided, separated from the river. So the idea is how to say, to re-engage the river in the dynamics of public spaces, but also finding some solutions for flooding and some rebuilding some ecological networks. And here we can see some of the works, just one for each one of the areas. I'm not going to explain the works because are projects by the students of the 3rd year of architecture, but I think the experience itself is meaningful despite the design results. But here, for example, the idea was how to create a sort of hybrid park where some areas are floodable areas and they can produce also an ecological improvement of the water, but also a leisure place for continuous greenway along the Molgora stream. But this kind of project, for example, other students developed a very detailed proposal about the purification of water, the storage of water, the reuse of water, all topics that are involved in the contemporary scenario of climate change. Then, going towards the city, you can see how they tried to use the water of the Molgora as a material of the public space, and also how to address to the Molgora, for example, the rainwater collecting along the streets, in the buildings of this residential area, using some shapes of the water for collecting, purifying, and then moving the water towards the stream. Again, working on that area very close to the sports center, is another place where the discussion was about how to give back naturality to the river, so how to create humid areas, how to re-involve the space, and how to create a public space that is basically the public space of the river Molgora. And finally, the last area where the topic was again about sort of renaturalization and also involvement of the public space in a sort of center for the linear park of the river Molgora. Some topics are the same in the same area because of sort of necessity, didactical necessity. I think this experience is quite interesting also compared to my present researches, because now I'm working on the topic of maintenance. So, for example, the river Molgora is very expressive of a reality that is also a reality that requires a lot of maintenance, because we are talking of hydraulic works that are more than 50 years old. So the stability of the banks, the quality of the bridges, and all the parts that are making this place extremely artificial are also extremely fragile. So how to deal with the problem of maintenance in a creative way, this is also another topic that is very important for me. And I think the projects of the students are just sort of visible result of a process, but are not dealing with all this complexity that is a theoretical complexity represented by this physical element of the space. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrea. It's true that one can be puzzled by this violence to put the river in that sewer. But then now I'm very impatient to listen to Angela after listening to Andrea, because when one sees the images, it's really very surprising.
I'll switch on the PPRI, and we can talk about this later on. The awareness between prudence, regulations, and progress is not really there. And the question about the rules and the inventions in L'Abri and Le Faire still needs to be discussed. Angela, I cannot see you. I don't know you, actually. That's why I don't see you. You come from Berlin, and you're going to talk about the migrations and the provisional settlements. So you have the floor.
Hi. My name is Angela Alcantara. I'm from Manila in the Philippines, and I'm an architect and design researcher based in Berlin. And today I want to talk to you about provisional settlements as persistent schemes, so the potentials of temporal refuge spaces. You've been talking about it a lot, all these floods that have been happening, unexpected torrential rain, the sudden influx of migrants coming into cities, a worldwide pandemic that we're all in right now. Spaces of and for refuge are constantly built. Disasters and risks keep bringing them back. And these problems that we encounter are not going to go away. You've all mentioned it also, that recurrent disasters have been happening, and provisional settlements that are usually temporal, very short-term solutions, much more often than not, turn into more long-term solutions. They occur mostly in developing countries, but these cases are not limited to the developed world. There are three particular lessons that I would like to talk about today that we consider whenever we build these spaces. These are the grid, lighting and sterility, and accessibility. Thanks. And I would like to use three cases from the city that I live in, which is Berlin, to talk about these ideas, starting with the Tempelhof Airport, the International Congress Center of Berlin, and a bit differently from these two, this little house along Märkisches Canal. The starting point of this topic started with the trivial idea of difference being something problematic. building on Gilles Deleuze's philosophy on difference and repetition, and intersecting with Jane Jacobs' Eyes on the Street, and the consideration of city inefficiencies and impracticalities, I work around their common notion that indifference, in its persistence, holds much value. So let's jump into the first case. This is one of the hangars of the Tempelhof Airport, so it's where they were housing all the aircrafts, parking the aircrafts, and, like a workshop. It was built in the pre-Nazi era, and operations were closed in 2008. Pictured here is the Berlin Art Fair from around this time last year. The perpendicular airfield has also been transformed into Berlin's largest public park, which is called Tempelhof Field. But in late 2015, it was the largest refugee camp in Berlin, housing up to 1,300 refugees. This is the exact same hangar in the previous slide. But yeah, as we can see here, I would like to discuss the first lesson that I mentioned, which is the grid. The general idea was an initial stage, short-term emergency shelter, housing refugees before being designated to other parts of the country. But actual numbers, of course, showed that stays intended for weeks extended into months. And the problem is already evident from the perspective. Minimal sleeping modules, an average of 10 beds, which doesn't really relate to 10 people per sleeping space. Conditions were designed with the provision of the most basic of physical needs, while ignoring any provision for social needs. But this grid happens. It's necessary. It's a logistical solution with an event like this. For example, if it was like a flood that happened in the middle of a European city, unexpectedly, you would be able to build this really fast and provide shelter for people. It's a great quick fix. But if we look at it from a different perspective, a little bit more in a dramatic image, between the tents and thin partitions that enclose sleeping modules, the distances between sleeping quarters mirrored occupied sidewalks and streets. Emergency shelters like this are not meant to be short-term quarters, but temporal and rushed does not mean we should extract any consideration of humanity. The persistent and informal use of these streets in facilities like Tempelhof attests to the need and for us to exhibit the importance of activation and enabling of these in-between spaces when we build all these grids. I'd like to jump into another case, which is another colossal structure, the International Congress Center of Berlin. Unlike Tempelhof Airport, which intersects 3 of Berlin's neighborhoods, the ICC is decentralized in another end of the city, and it's right next to one of the most known German highways. But back in 2015, it was another large-scale initial emergency center in Berlin that housed an average of 600 people at a time. The scale and condition were in parallel to Tempelhof, but particular to the ICC, as you can probably see in the photos, there were no windows in this space. There was zero natural light. The problem of this was the sterile and artificial feel that it gave. You can even see it on the tarpaulins that they had put on the railings, which were, because of building regulations and because of the masses of children that were there, were necessary. But yes, all these interventions did not contribute to any form of well-being. Let's remember that this is like the first point of contact when people are running from wars in their countries, or if you're a family that lost your home in a flood. This is the kind of space that you will be entering for refuge, even for a short term of time. It's very important for us to reconsider how we treat all these spaces and how we see that things such as light and adaptability could make such a difference. I particularly like this little intervention of a little window that a child painted on. Yeah, just a little thing. And what's interesting also is that next to the ICC Berlin, so because it's an exhibition hall, there are a lot of different halls that it has. There was one more hall that was used as a refugee camp, which it has the same grid and conditions as the other refuge spaces, but with the light added, it makes quite a difference. Recently, beds are back in the halls, but today it's a different emergency that we're all facing. Although like the refugee cases, the conversion of the halls were by way of a grid. However, the parallels stop at scale and urgent need. Of course, there are grave differences in typology, migration versus pandemic, scale of inhabitants. This particular case, it was only supposed to be an extension for the overflow of patients in primary hospitals in Berlin for COVID-19, which, on the side note, thankfully, these beds were actually never used. But yeah, that's another conversation. Temporary, of course, the discussion between temporary dwelling and temporary medical care. But perhaps more crucially, there's a difference in socialization. But I will set that aside for now, because interestingly enough, it was also everything beyond the grid modules that made this quite special. A transfer system was used in the existing hall, so all electrical, oxygen, data, whatever supply you have would come from above, and all the mobile devices were placed at the ground level. But beyond the high-tech, the ground level is what I find to be much more interesting, actually. It's the simple use of wayfinding by color coding of the linoleum flooring. In the photo, you can see the green flooring, which is for general care. In another part of the hall, the flooring is blue, which is for more major ventilation cases. Today, the reusability of the total construction of this site is at 90%. But moving forward, I have found this comparison with the refugee shelters. While this situation stem from adverse situations, this comparison gives a glimpse into potentials of problems when considered from a different approach. Although in this case it is a necessary sterile solution, but there is a big difference that light and the small intervention of wayfinding that can already change it up. Jumping into the third case, which is not a hall, in contrast to the scale of Tempelhof, it is one of the more unconventional temporal interventions constructed during the refugee crisis of 2015. The Haus Märkisches Ufer is a historic building surrounded by high-end hotels and embassies at the city center of Berlin. In 2016, it was converted into a refugee hostel. It provided shelter to 56 residents. The building is divided into 3 rooms per floor. All the housing is in the middle, and all the general shared spaces are in the ground floor and in the top floor. But I'd like to move beyond the interior of the space and bring it to its exterior. Because once you step out of the building and you step away from the exterior, you realize that actually the building is placed in a very central part of Berlin. If any of you have been in Berlin, this is actually one of the nicer sides of the city. Not everything looks like this. But what is really interesting about this is that it was placed right by a park. It's very close to the central library as well. So it's also very well connected for people who are trying to be integrated into the city. The architecture practiced something fantastic. Follow this project from conception to construction in personal interviews and with the first residents of the house. It was presented in the 2006 Vienna Biennale, German pavilion, entitled Making Heimat, Germany Arrival Country. In this case, it exemplified so much to learn from. There was a quote that I would like to read. "The need for housing like this will surely exist for a long time, and not only for refugees." While I do not mean to romanticize temporal solutions, my objective is to place importance on their existence, because the need for these spaces will keep coming back. Studies in what these spaces have to offer, taking a look at all their existing components and seeing the in-betweens that can be used when another disaster strikes. That there is harm, but there's also the inescapability of the grid. But we can consider it somehow from the perspective of a street. That light and the possibility of a less sterile look, we can't escape the lack of light in a certain situation. For example, if this was the particular hall that was provided to house, I don't know, a storm that was outside in this neighborhood. But with the use of artificial solutions, we can create warmth. It's from choosing just the right lighting or from giving the users the opportunity to, make the space a little more of theirs. And then the third, as I mentioned, is to consider not just what we do inside, but where we place all these spaces. Except for the third part, a lot of these interventions are at a very low cost. They require, at most, ad hoc planning. But with the idea of looking at all these little things that we can integrate into the spaces that we make, we can start preparing ourselves for the next disaster and for how we approach these spaces. Putting it in the words of Professor Todd May, we do something new, but we also repeat something that is old. Thank you.